Now, when I tell people that the focus of my studies in school, one of the focuses, was religious conflict resolution, I usually get like a blank stare or a quizzical stare or just some kind of a response of, what? What does that mean? Like, what are you talking about? Religion causes conflicts in the world, and it's a problem. And, you know, if we're going to solve these conflicts, then we need to leave religion outside the door. Okay? So that's not something that my experience has taught me or that I agree with. So I just want to start today by looking at this question of, is religion the problem? Okay, is religion the problem? We have religious violence, religious conflicts that are going on around the world. But religion cannot be said to be the only cause of these conflicts. There are many, many other underlying issues that play a role in religious conflict. And so if we're really going to understand a conflict, we have to look beyond the surface of the religious aspect and see what those underlying causes are. So some of these other causes can include injustice, history, politics, economics, social and cultural dimensions, and the big one, land and control of land. In his book, Terror in the Mind of God, The Global Rise of Religious Violence, Mark Juergensmeyer claims that violent acts committed by radical religious groups are merely religious responses to social situations. Again, violent acts committed by religious groups are merely religious responses to social situations. So violence does not stem from the religion itself, but can sometimes be how people of faith react to the political, social, and economic realities of their lives, if given religious leadership that takes them in a violent direction. Let's take the conflict in Northern Ireland, for example. So this is a conflict where the two opposing sides have traditionally been labeled as Catholics and as Protestants. Now, in this conflict, religious leaders, for example, like Reverend Ian Paisley, have taken on leadership roles. And so there's this conception that the conflict has something to do with theology, when really what the conflict is about is land. And one of the identifying factors of the two sides in the religion in the conflict are, you've got the Irish, who are traditionally Catholics, and you've got the English, who are traditionally Protestants. But many of the people who are involved in the conflict aren't actually all that religious. They're not people who engage in religious practices. They're not people who go to any kind of service. So it really is a misrepresentation to call this conflict a religious conflict. Another example that we can look at is America's so-called war on terror. Now, this conflict is traditionally depicted as, you've got the Islamic world versus the West, and you've got Samuel Huntington writing The Clash of Civilizations about how these people have polarizing views of how the world is, and that we have to be fundamentally opposed and be ready for these conflicts that are coming in the future. But the fact is that this conflict is about so much more than religion. You know, there's a whole history of colonialism and imperialism, the glaring poverty gap that exists between the two cultures. Those are just a few of the many, many factors that come into play in creating and perpetuating this conflict. Now, I'm not denying that religion plays a role in conflict. I think people who would do that would be naive. But I want to point out that religious conflicts are more than they seem. Okay? You can't just say that two religious groups cannot get along together, because the fact is that people of different faiths have been working alongside one another for many, many years. So religion's not the core problem. These conflicts arise from history and from power struggles. So how do these non-religious conflicts become religious conflicts. Now, often the religious element is brought into conflicts by figures who are in positions of power. Now, quite often these people aren't even all that faithful themselves, but it's politically expedient for them to draw on religion. Martin E. Marty wrote an article called "Is Religion the Problem?" and he states that people need justifications for their most vile acts, and crediting or blaming God is the strongest way to do it. One of the easiest ways for political leaders to gain the support of people is to invoke the will of God. Historically, this has been a very effective strategy. One example that comes to my mind is the use of just war theory. Now, this is a theory that was designed to limit wars. It was supposed to stop leaders from going to war. But it's consistently being abused by people in power. Proponents of just war theory invariably are able to justify any wars in which they happen to be involved with, right? Two classic examples are George Bush and George W. Bush and their wars in Iraq. Both of them, if you analyze their reasons for going to war, draw on elements of the just war theory, and they portray them in such a way as to support their ideas and to support the conflict there. So we have a conflict that's to do with things other than religion, and religious leaders and political leaders bring in religion and change the nature of the conflict by turning it into a religious conflict. Now, once religious language is invoked in a conflict, the nature of the conflict changes in two very important ways. So I'm going to ask you a question right now, and I want you to consider the answer in your head. I'm not asking you to raise your hands because this is very personal. Think of an important political leader who you esteem and you admire. Okay. So how far would you be willing to go in your actions to support this political leader? Would you die for them? Would you kill for them? Now think of the God or gods of your religious tradition. How far in your actions would you go to support the will of God? Would you die? Would you kill? Generally speaking, people are willing to go to much further extremes for their God than they are for a political ideology. Now, I'm not saying that the history of people fighting for political ideologies, such as democracy and capitalism, are unstained, but people will do virtually anything if they truly believe that it is sanctioned by God and that they are fulfilling the will of God, because the authority of God goes beyond the authority that any human being can possibly possess. Now, this means that people are willing to commit atrocious acts for their gods that they would not ever consider for any other cause. This obviously has drastic implications on the commitment of those involved in the struggle, because in religious conflicts, people believe they are embroiled in a cosmic battle against a demonic enemy instead of an earthly battle about human concerns. So the first major difference between a religious and non-religious conflict is the commitment of the people involved. The second drastic change that bringing religion into a conflict has is the conflict's scope. So Mark Juergensmeyer describes how non-religious struggles are usually resolved within the lifetime of the participants. Okay, so you think of something like World War II, which wasn't a religious conflict. You had an enemy, you had the Allied forces who got together, they overthrew the Nazis, and the war was over. But if you think of religious wars, religious conflicts, they last from generation to generation to generation, and it just keeps going until the narratives change, until the understanding of a religions change. So the cosmic nature of religious conflict means that it endures long after the people who started it have perished, because Satan is a constant threat that cannot be negotiated with or ever destroyed entirely. Now just think of the number of crusades that the Christians fought in. So if, as we've established, those embroiled in religious violence are willing to go to superhuman extremes in what they see as a cosmic war that will be fought for generations, Juergensmeyer identifies several possible ways that we can deal with this religious violence. So the first one he discusses is destroying violence. Now this means literally that you either kill off or you forcibly contain all of those people who are committing acts of violence. The problem with this method is, as we have seen with the coalition forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, is this type of attitude can often actually facilitate the terrorists. It actually feeds into their plans. So they have a narrative in which, the West is this demonic enemy who is going to come in and, they kill innocent civilians, that they have no respect, infidels, all this kind of stuff. And so when the coalition forces go in and they do those things, it just plays right into their plans, and they end up with all of these brand new recruits who are eager to do their bit. Two other challenges that can be faced with this are, in order to accomplish destroying violence, you must be able to identify those who are involved in the conflict, and they must be contained within a geographic space. And as we've seen with the War on Terror, the soldiers are having all kinds of troubles because they can't figure out who are the militants and who are not. And they don't just exist in Afghanistan and Iraq, they exist in our own backyards. So destroying violence is not really a very feasible option. Okay? The second option he talks about is terrifying the terrorists. So in this case, you threaten violent reprisal or imprisonment. Now, these threats have to be so severe that they're actually going to stop the perpetrators from committing acts of violence. The problem with this perspective is that usually, if you think that you're engaged in a cosmic war and that you're fighting for the will of God, you're expecting that there are going to be casualties. You're expecting that people are going to die, people are going to be imprisoned, and you accept it. And that's just part of the conflict. So that tactic doesn't usually work. The third response is that violence wins in some way. So the violent acts that the perpetrators commit are stacked up, basically, and they're used as bargaining chips in the negotiation process. Now, this is what many violent groups are hoping for and why they engage in acts of violence. But obviously, if you're wanting to reduce violence, saying that, oh, well, because you did this bombing, we're going to negotiate with you, is sending the wrong message that, oh, if you commit acts of violence, then we'll take you seriously. So those are three options that don't really sound very great. With each of these three options, the challenges in achieving the elimination of violence are insurmountable, because even in a best case scenario, so even supposing that you are able to accomplish one of these tasks, either destroying the people who are committing violence, terrifying them, or letting them win, the best case scenario is that you have a negative peace. And what that means is your peace is just an absence of war. So you haven't dealt with the real issues of the conflict, and the conflict between the people still exists. It's just latent now. You just don't have people fighting in the streets. Excuse me. Now, some people would argue that because those three options don't work, the most feasible option that we have left is actually taking religion out of the conflict resolution process. That the religious should be taken out of the political arena entirely. and just left to people's private lives. Now, the problem with this is that people who fight and die and kill in the name of religion aren't likely to accept a resolution in which their religion is set aside and not taken into consideration at all. So it is my belief that in the face of religious violence, we must employ religious conflict resolution to bring about a positive peace instead of a negative one. Religious conflict resolution theory states, if religion plays a significant role in causing a conflict or in the lives of people involved in a conflict, religion must be taken into consideration in the conflict's resolution because failing to do so neglects both the roots of the conflict and the peace-building tools that religion can provide. That's really long, so we're going to break that down and go over it again. So, if religion plays a significant role in causing a conflict or in the lives of the people involved in a conflict, religion must be taken into consideration in the conflict's resolution because failing to do so neglects the roots of the conflict and the peace-building tools that religion can provide. Now, we've talked quite a bit already about how religion can play a significant, though not exclusive, role in causing conflict, and how the religious dimension changes the nature of a conflict. According to religious conflict resolution theory, if religion has played a role in fueling a conflict, then any resolution that precludes religion is not addressing an integral part of what has caused the conflict. So without addressing all of the roots of the conflict, any resolution you might accomplish is actually only going to be temporary because the underlying causes are going to come forth one way or another, and you're going to have a breakout of violence again. So let's take the conflict of various Christian churches and the Holy Sepulchre, for example. So the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built about some 900 years ago on what is considered the holiest site in Christendom. So it's supposed to be the site of Jesus' crucifixion, his entombment, and his resurrection. So this church has been the source of an intractable conflict between 6 different Christian denominations ever since it was built. After years of fighting and changing ownership of various parts of the church, in 1852, a decree was passed called the status quo. So until the status quo, ownership and rights to worship and rituals in the space had been kind of constantly changing and moving, and there'd been a lot of conflict. So he said, okay, so whoever has rights right now, you keep your rights, and nobody gets any new rights, and that's the way that it's going to be. Now, what they hoped and what they did accomplish by passing this decree was they took the conflict of the Holy Sepulchre out of the international political arena, whereas it had been a part of international politics and had actually been part of the cause of the Crimean War. But the problem was that this decree permanently fixed the possession, usage, and ceremony of the Holy Sepulchre, according to who had control of it at the time. So because this decree failed to address the roots of the conflict, all it did was lock the parties into a permanent state of grudging ownership, which actually continues to have outbreaks of physical violence today. We actually, if you read stories, there are instances where monks who are celebrating service have actually smuggled in weapons because they've anticipated there being a breakout of violence, and there are people like above in the roof throwing extra weapons down, and you've got monks like knocking each other out in the middle of the church, which is on the holiest site of all in Christendom. So it continues to happen today. So addressing the roots of conflicts is essential in peace-building processes, and to neglect religion in the resolution of a religious conflict can never bring about peace. So now let's go back and look at the second scenario in which religious conflict resolution is supposed to be used, and that's in situations where religion plays a significant role in the lives of the people who are involved in the conflict. Now, if religion plays a significant role in your life, you're going to understand everything that happens to you in the context of religion, right? I mean, even if something happens that you don't understand, the response is, how could God let this happen? How does this fit into my contextual frame? So from that perspective, even a non-religious conflict that hasn't actually brought in elements of religion, should use some element of religious conflict resolution because it has an important role in the lives of the people who are involved. So the religious conflict resolution theory goes on to talk about the peace-building tools that religion can provide. Religious actors enjoy a very unique and important role in societies around the world. They enjoy an authority and a credibility that political actors lack. So whereas, democratically elected political leaders are only in power for a very short time, and the entire time that they're in power, they're just thinking about, how do I get myself reelected? And whereas non-democratic political leaders force their way in through violence and coercion and are also only concerned with how they can maintain power, religious leaders are usually at least semi-permanent, and their concern is supposed to be with the reign of God. So this gives them a very unique position in the minds of the people who are involved in conflict. Now, they also live and serve people who live in all levels of society. And so they have a unique position of moral authority, and they actually have a freedom to say things that politicians dare not. Only got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to skip some stuff here. But if you have questions, we can talk about that later. So as well as religious actors, religious institutions enjoy a unique and important role that can be used in peace-building processes. As institutions that exist at kind of local, subnational, national, regional, and international realms, they can play a very unique role in the peace-building process. They run public places of worship that exist outside the influence of political leaders, and these places of worship can actually often do double as community centers, so places where people can come together, they can talk about things that are concerning them. They have their own channels of communication that are independent of civil structures and civil society. So when official channels of communication break down, so say you have two presidents or political leaders who won't talk anymore, you can actually have the religious actors can still be in touch, and they can still communicate with one another in a way that people at other levels can't. So churches, synagogues, temples, and mosques can provide alternate unofficial channels for people to communicate. And when leaders are looking for spaces to host negotiations, workshops, grassroots training, churches can provide the required space. As well as providing logistical support through public spaces, religious institutions can also help in creating new rituals and new narratives that actually bring people together in the wake of violence and conflict. It can provide a language of healing, a language of forgiveness. Earlier we talked about how bringing the religious element into a conflict transforms a conflict by increasing both the commitment of the people and the scope of the conflict they're involved in. We said that people are willing to go to extremes for religion that they would not otherwise consider, and their belief is they are engaged in a cosmic war. The same can be said of bringing religion into the conflict resolution process. So a religious narrative of forgiveness and reconciliation enables people to draw on their faith and to help them to forgive acts of violence that they might not otherwise be capable of forgiving, but that they need to in order to move forward and create peace. And if they understand God's will as being peace, then again, they're going to go to different extremes in order to achieve that, and they're going to teach their children and their children's children, and it'll go from generation to generation, those new narratives. A great example of this is actually kind of the US-Mexico border conflict. It's a really interesting conflict because politically you've got NAFTA and they get along great, but if you actually go to the border, anyone who's been to that border, and you see all the fences and you know about border patrol, like that's a conflict. That's a latent conflict, but that's a conflict. Now there's this park in San Diego that's ironically called Friendship Park, and it used to be a place where Mexicans and Americans would come together and meet. And there's now a fence there, and actually as part of like the Operation Gatekeeper and the increased Border Patrol, they're actually going to be closing the park to put in a triple wall. One's not enough, you need 3. Because they don't have anything better to spend their money on. But that's another argument. Anyway, there's this religious ritual that's grown out of a Christian ecumenical movement, and they go to Friendship Park every week, every Sunday, and there's a minister there, and he goes through the services communion, and he does it in both English and Spanish, and so you've got the English people on the American side, and the Mexicans and other Latinos on the other side. And when it comes to sharing communion, he actually passes the bread, which is a tortilla, passes it through the fence so that people on the other side can receive. Now, this is illegal. This is an act of civil disobedience, but it's just a beautiful, amazing ritual showing how we are united. We are together, and people of different faiths have started to join in. There's actually a Buddhist group now who go, and before the communion service, they sit on the US side, and again, you've got Latinos on the other side, and they sit and they meditate together. So you've got people meditating, followed by sharing the Christian communion, and so it's just this beautiful ritual of showing how we're together and we can work together. So that's an example of religious conflict resolution in action. I could go on, but I'm going to leave it here for today. So let's just review what we've talked about this evening. So religious actors and institutions are ideally placed to facilitate peace-building processes. Their moral authority, their presence among different levels of society, and their ability to operate at different levels of leadership. So they operate at grassroots level, kind of middle level, top level leadership, and their concern with the reign of God give them a presence and a credibility that other actors lack in the peace-building process. Now, if you're faced with a religious conflict or a conflict in which religion plays a significant role in the lives of those involved, why wouldn't you draw on those peace-building tools in order to help you with the resolution? If we don't employ religious conflict resolution in the face of religious violence, we're left with 3 alternatives: either letting violence win, terrifying the terrorists into submission, or killing off or forcibly confining those who are committing acts of violence. And because bringing religion into a conflict alters the commitment and the scope of a conflict, these 3 options are not solutions that are going to create a positive peace, which is what we want to see happen. Once religion has been brought into a conflict that has developed due to history, economics, social situation, poverty gap, land, etc., religion really must be considered in a conflicts resolution. In her paper, Two Cultures of Religion as Obstacles to Peace, Elise Boulding states that there are 2 contrasting cultures in every faith tradition: the holy war and the peaceful garden. And I think we've been focusing for far too long on the holy war tradition, and it's time to focus on the peaceful garden. Thanks.